Well, I appreciate Ken's sharing his thoughts with us about his own story and his own journey. I'm always thankful to hear that you all find blessings in this community. We exist for no other reason than that we can be blessed through the experience. This passage in Luke 14 is very strange to me. It's the first verse says they were watching him, and it's evident that he's watching them. So everyone's watching each other. And we have Jesus's observations, and he has words to say to the guests who came in, and he has something to say to the host. But to me, the odd thing is that unlike what we know to be the interest of Jesus, he says nothing about the change of attitude that needs to occur. I mean, the host and the guests, I would say, display attitudes that are not really the ones that Jesus is interested in. Well, the guests are interested in promoting themselves, right? They're interested in being honored. And his advice seems to be merely a better strategy for how to be honored. It doesn't seem to be anything like you ought not to be so selfishly ambitious. You should not be interested in self promotion. You should not be interested in how others see you. You should be different. He doesn't say that. Rather, he says, I'm observing how you're coming in, and really there's a better way to do this if you really want to be honored in the eyes of others. Right? So pretend like you're humble, and maybe that'll result in a good reward of being exalted. So it's all about pretending. He's not asking anyone to be humble. He's asking people to put on a show of humility. Today, we would perhaps call that virtue signaling. You familiar with the term? Kind of comes from social media. It's where people like to not truly be virtuous, but they like to display things that indicate their virtue, right? So recently I saw something, a man had written this Facebook post about his son who was turning 7. And the post said, "You're just such a wonderful son. I'm, so happy to be your father. You're just marvelous," and all this kind of stuff. And someone else asked him, "Well, it's a great post, but why didn't you tag your son?" And the man said, "Well, he doesn't have a Facebook account." And the point is, well, then he's never going to read this. You wrote this quote unquote to him. He's never going to see it. Who did you write it for then? He's basically displaying what a good father he is. So everyone sees, wow, what a good father he is, how much he loves his son. He didn't really say it to his son. That's virtue signaling. And it's frequent in social media, where we put ourselves first, forward in a kind of way and say, oh, I'm someone who really cares about the poor. But actions, of course, speak a lot louder than social posts. But in some ways, Jesus seems to be doing that. It's just like virtue signaling in his day. Act as if you're humble, but your real desire is to be promoted. And he says something similar to the host because the host is perhaps interested in getting something in return for his inviting others to this event. And Jesus doesn't seem to say, no, you ought to do good for good's sake, or something like you just really ought to be interested in helping the poor. He says, no, if you invite people who cannot invite you back, then your reward will be better. I mean, in some ways, he's not challenging the fact that the guy's still doing it for a reward. Not that knowing there are certain things that we might receive is completely wrong. At the same time, I think there's a greater, more important reason for the good we do, not with an eye towards some reward, be it even heavenly, but because there is something innate about good and doing good. So why does Jesus then talk both to the guests, to the host, and doesn't seem to really speak to their attitudes and the need to change, but simply some suggestions about changing their behaviors? Well, I would say that Jesus is giving very imperfect advice. It's not the most perfect, mature, thoughtful response he could give, but kind of, well, maybe you could do this. He's not getting to the heart of the matter. Why not? So I'm asking myself this question, and here's my thoughts that even acting humble is helpful when a person isn't, in fact, humble. That maybe what Jesus understands is he understands these guests. If he said, look, you just don't need to be interested in promoting yourselves and how others see you, that's not going to get through to them at all. That's not even a consideration for them. They're consumed with having the best places. And him just, as it were, chastising them for their attitudes is not going to make any change. But maybe the best that Jesus can do in the situation, and he can't do what is perfect. In other words, he can't do the best, which is get them to change their hearts. Maybe what he can do is get them to engage in a kind of new behavior that might, in fact, start leading them in a direction. In other words, it might be a beginning of change in their lives. And I think this is very true that for us, sometimes when we start to do things that our hearts are not even in yet, we kind of do it under protest. We do it very reluctantly. We're kind of, I don't know if I can really feel good about this, but we do it anyway. Maybe there is some good. Maybe we end up acting our way into a new way of feeling and thinking rather than feeling and thinking our way into a new way of acting. And so I think what Jesus is doing is, in fact, the help he can give to these guests. If they start really choosing the more humble seats, and they, even though they want to be promoting themselves, start not promoting themselves, maybe after a while they'll start forgetting about promoting themselves as much. And maybe the host, if the host throws a party for people who cannot pay him back, even though he might be completely concerned about inviting the guests who will benefit him in some way, maybe after the experience of hosting some people who can't pay him back, maybe his heart will start to change and say, well, that was pretty wonderful. I enjoyed that. I wouldn't have thought of bringing these people into my home, but now I did. And I think I'll do it again. Sometimes when it's hard to get to our hearts, to the motive of things, maybe the practices which lean in that direction are what we need. In some ways, Jesus is recommending to the host and the guests about changing the appearances without changing their hearts. And while we recognize that is not what would be at the heart of Jesus's own concern, maybe it's a step in the right direction. One of the hardest things I think we do is to confront the motives behind our own actions. I don't know for you, but for me, my motives are always mixed. And I often hate to admit it to myself that I really don't do anything out of a kind of pure selfless motive. There's always an eye towards personal benefits, to the potential for other people appreciating it, appreciating me, thinking well of me. I mean, I can't just erase that out of my life. It's always there. What I hope to do is make it the lesser motive rather than the greater motive. In other words, I want to kind of tamp it down. I want to keep saying no to myself. I need to be doing this for these better reasons while being honest with myself, but you're always thinking somewhat about your own benefit, aren't you? Sometimes the best way to handle that dark side of our motives is to make sure we're confessing it to ourselves and not pretending it's not there. What Jesus really wants, and as Rachel in Children's Time illustrated, and I love stories that come from Australia. If you don't know what a wombat is, wonderful little creatures, not actually all that little, but that was a cute story. Um, and the wombat was reluctant in many ways and yet still did it, right? So it kind of fit really well because that's what we're admitting. Sometimes we're reluctant to do the things that are good, but when we do them anyway, there's a benefit that it starts to change us. But what Jesus is talking about is how we live in a kind of manner that shapes our social interactions. Christianity is not about adhering to a lot of truth statements. It's primarily about how we treat others. That's where we say the rubber meets the road. That's where it actually means something or doesn't. Because we all know we can sign on to a lot of true statements about Jesus being the Son of God and being born of a virgin and being raised from the dead and make all these statements, but they mean very little if we have not found a way of living that reshapes our interactions with one another. If it doesn't change how we love our neighbor, then it's not Christianity. It might be a philosophy we hold in our heads, but it's not Christianity. So the other part of these statements from Jesus to the guests and to the hosts have everything to do with their relationships. How do the guests relate to one another? Well, what Jesus observes is they're all in competition with one another. They're trying to better one another. They're trying to get ahead of one another. It's all about competition for prestige, for honor, for place, for position, for power, for money. And that's a pretty good description of a lot of the way our world works. But Jesus is talking about new kinds of relationships. Part of the story that puzzles me a little bit more is how Jesus talks to the host and says, invite in the poor and the lame. The part we didn't read, which is verses 2 through 6, there's a man there with edema. Now, is it lymphedema? I don't know what kind of edema, but edema is, in the old translation, dropsy. It's a swelling of the body due to the retention of fluids. And Jesus heals this man on a Sabbath, so it's somewhat scandalous. Was that guy invited? Because it says after he heals him, he sends him away. Does that mean was he one of the invited guests who was invited because he's rich or something? Or was he someone who, if this is a kind of a big social event happening perhaps in a courtyard, is he just an onlooker from the town who's come to observe from the fringes, who's not really invited, but Jesus sees him, calls him forward, heals him and sends him away. But the odd thing is there is someone there, the lame, the cripple, right? And maybe that goes to Ken's point about how God places in our lives people with whom we need to interact that are there because there's some way in which we can show them the love of God. So how ironic it is that maybe this person with this edema was not invited by the host. And Jesus says you need to invite people such as that person. And yet he was there already, wasn't he? It's not like he wasn't present. He was there. Maybe the host could have invited him. Maybe that's a little bit what Jesus has in mind. Think of people like that man. Invite them. Those who are not well off, those who are struggling. And so we, taking to heart Jesus' words for us today, we need to ask ourselves the questions. Let's be honest about our motives. Let's sometimes lean into what we know to be a better course of action, even if we don't genuinely feel it in our hearts. That doesn't mean you're being fake or inauthentic, as long as you're honest about the fact that you don't feel it in your heart, right? There's nothing inauthentic about saying, I'm trying to do something I don't feel that great about doing. So sometimes we need to do that. We need to examine our motives. We need to do the kinds of things, the spiritual disciplines that are not easy, but will have a shaping effect. And perhaps also realize that, as the saying goes, every great journey begins with the first step. And maybe the beginning is to just do something a little bit more in the direction of love of others than what we've been doing. Maybe it's not the epitome of the expression of that, but maybe if we can do something a little bit more each day, we'll be on that journey. And may God himself, through Christ who sends the Spirit, help us in this kind of life. Amen.